Well, before we invite Peter on, I'd just like to add a little bit about current affairs. Of yesterday, no doubt you'll have heard that we, the taxpayers, are going to spend £50 million on trying to do something about the fact that so many people, I don't think they specified who, so many people can't speak English. The figure is apparently 770,000 people can't speak English. Didn't say who they were. And there's a problem with integration in schools. They need to do something about that. I mean, this is such a surprise, isn't it? But what really got me, because I listened to the Today programme yesterday morning, and about 7:30 they had an expert on about this very issue. Well, no, that's right. They started off by interviewing people in the area one of the areas, because there's 5 areas, aren't there, that are going to be helped out to learn English, to learn English, to help the women get jobs, and it was to do the integration in schools. How they're going to do it, I don't know. And who was the first person to be interviewed on this programme? I think from Manchester. No, it was from Bradford, that's right. It wasn't, it was an Asian gentleman who spoke very good English with a Yorkshire accent. But what was he complaining about? He wasn't saying that it's our people, our women that need this help. He was just having a rant about how vicious all the white people were, and they're attacking them. I'm afraid to go out, my family's afraid to go out. Nothing to do with this. And so I switched off, because that's what I do with the Today programme now. I mean, what bloody bias. I don't know whether they did come back to, it was implying that they were the problem, not us, our community. And so this is what we're up against. I mean, I'm actually very concerned about how freedom of speech and freedom of thought even is declining. So with no further ado, I invite Peter to the chair here.
Thank you very much, Peter.
You okay with it being recorded?
Fine, no
okay.
problem. No problem.
And if you can tell us what your talk's going to be about.
Yeah, well, since I'm being recorded, I'll try not to say anything too illegal today.
Resign.
Though
we don't have to broadcast it.
Yeah, I suppose it could be selectively edited, but we are at a time when we're extraordinarily under attack, as Richard was saying a moment ago, by an utterly paranoid establishment and mainstream media. The attack on YouTube, on Facebook, all of these things that once told us that we once thought were going to change life for nationalists completely. Well, yes, to a certain extent they have changed things, because even at a time when we're electorally in decline, the establishment are worried to death about the presence of our sort of people online, about the fact that young people in particular can get access to that sort of information, can get access to alternative sources of news. Just the other day, just in the run-up to the London Forum YouTube being taken down, an extraordinary set of articles was put up on an online news site, quite a well-known mainstream online news site called Vice.com, I believe. And this was making out that there's a dangerous Nazi international based in London with tentacles reaching out across the globe. It was the sort of thing that, had it been the other way around, it was a bit like the sort of thing that you would have read in an Arnold Leese publication about the Jews, except that it was our tentacles all around the globe. You half expected to see a cartoon of a spider or an octopus with Jez Turner's head and all these arms and tentacles reaching out from London across the globe. Such is their terror. And rather curiously, one of the things they highlighted at the start of this article, rather cheekily, they said one of the opening paragraphs was South Kensington, 2017. A man, a grey-haired, balding man, they said, with the air of an elderly academic, is stuck in a revolving door at a four-star hotel. And he is wanting to gain access to this hotel so that he can listen to anti-Semitic speeches at this forum event. And a great mob, and it was obvious who the heroes of this story were, ladies and gentlemen. A great mob of brave anti-fascists are out on the streets, daring to confront this man. They're daring to take the risk of confronting this man because he'd dared to walk down the street into the revolving door, holding a sandwich and a cup of coffee, said in this article. How sinister is that? And stuck in the revolving door, he consumed this coffee and this sandwich while the brave anti-fascists outside yelled and screamed and shouted about the Nazi in a box, as the slogan had it. Well, tonight, ladies and gentlemen, the Nazi is unboxed and live and in person. But of course, the most sinister thing about that story is that they sort of, if you've been reading the article, you might have thought that this sort of rather doddery chap with the air of an elderly academic was stuck in the revolving door because he couldn't work his way out of the revolving door, or perhaps the people, the hoteliers had locked him out because he was such a disreputable chap. They didn't want him on their premises. The fact of the matter was, of course, we all know the reason why that revolving door had been locked on the inside. It was because, as has happened time and time again down the decades, the owner of the premises there was legitimately concerned that the howling mob of anti-fascists would either do damage to his premises, do damage to his legitimate customers, or assault his staff. And these are the brave anti-fascists who were celebrated in this article, and that's the reason why that door was locked. And time again, we've one incident at the Mitre Hotel in Manchester back in the 1990s. When the Antifa got wind of a venue that was being used next to Manchester Cathedral, the old Mitre Hotel, which incidentally later got blown up by the IRA, been an unconnected thing. But they got wind of that and phoned up the staff, phoned up the manager, and when he said, well, I've taken the money for the booking, it's a booking like any other, he got anonymous phone calls saying, well, how would you like it if your barmaid's face got slashed with a glass? That's the sort of behaviour that we've come to expect from these brave anti-fascists. Well, it must be said, compared to the anti-fascists of the 1990s, who included close associates of IRA and INLA bombers and terrorists, the Harrods bomber, of course, was part of this anti-fascist gang close to anti-fascist action, Red Action in North London. The people who bombed Warrington were similarly part of that network, that gang. These youngsters with their black masks on might like to be in that league, but aren't quite in that league yet. But nevertheless, they're all of they're sort of wannabe terrorists, if you like, who haven't quite made it yet. But their aim is to be of the same ilk as those people who were planting bombs at Harrods and planting bombs at Warrington, killing children. That's the type of people that we're dealing with. Now, meanwhile, the mainstream media is, as I say, obsessed by the so-called Nazi threat. And not only today's Nazi threat, it seems that the way to sell newspapers is to put a fascist on the cover. Last week, and the week before, day after day after day, the Daily Mail of all newspapers, the newspaper that once published an editorial by its owner saying "Hurrah for the black shirts" in the days of Sir Oswald Mosley and the pre-war BUF, day after day they devoted the front page and page after page inside to an attack on Max Mosley for leaflets that he'd put out at a by-election in Manchester more than 55 years ago. This is what counts as news for some of our best-selling newspapers, to revisit a by-election campaign and to hammer home to people. The purpose of this was partly a personal vendetta against Max Mosley for his involvement in seeking to curb media abuses, and the mainstream press don't want too much investigation of that. They've already succeeded in restraining the Leveson inquiry, so that, for example, the investigations of their use of dodgy private detectives over the years, some of whom are involved in organised crime, the Murdochs of this world and the Rothermeres of this world, their involvement with that sort of borderline illegal activity or outrageously illegal activity, they don't want that to be looked at, and so they dredge up the fascist smear. But the other purpose of this is to bring home to anybody, any undergraduate, any young professional that's going to the London Forum, when they put that story day after day after day in the Daily Mail, the purpose is to say to those people, we won't forget. Even if you download an Alison Chablow video, even if you turn up at the London Forum, even if you turn up at a court case in support of somebody being jailed for political offences, we'll be making careful notes. And in 50 years' time even, we'll be on your case, saying that you were involved in evil racism, evil Nazism. That's the game that they're playing with that Max Mosley story.
Can I just add a point of information there? In the Daily Mail online, of course, they had article after article after article about Max Mosley, the newspaper thing. And that's the only case when they wouldn't allow any comments. Normally, they'll allow comments, and on more than half the articles, they moderate them, i.e. they censor them. But on that case, you couldn't even comment.
Yeah, and
that's freedom of speech for you.
Which is extraordinary. And this was not just an incidental story. This was a story to which they devoted acres of newsprint over the space of a best part of a fortnight, day after day after day. And the relentless propaganda was also evident. I don't know how and the long perspective of our enemies on these things was also evident in a film that was released just a month or two ago. I don't know whether anyone else has had the chance to see it. It was a remake of the film of the Agatha Christie story Murder on the Orient Express. Now, you might not think that such a film would be the most obvious place to look for blatant political propaganda. But in two aspects, this devoted itself to real extreme propaganda. And that was in the very opening scene, in the sort of preview to the whole thing, before they even get on the train. In this particular film version, they set that in Jerusalem. Pre-war Jerusalem, 1930s Jerusalem, at the Wailing Wall. And Hercule Poirot, as you probably know, the Agatha Christie detective, who's the central character in the film, he, in this sort of preview to the main case, he's sorting out a case of a theft from a church in Jerusalem. And the three people are lined up representing the three faiths there in Jerusalem. A Jewish rabbi, a Muslim imam, and a Christian clergyman. And the theory being that one of these three must have stolen this priceless jewel from the chapel. To cut a long story short, Poirot, through various bits of deductive brilliance in the space of a couple of minutes, he actually discovers that the real villain of the case was an inspector of the British Palestine Police who'd actually stolen the jewel. Now, those of you that are familiar with the history of the British Mandate, and particularly the history of the period from 1945 to 48, will know that the people who the chosen in Hollywood, the producers who were behind this movie, who had to be sucked up to by the British actor and director Kenneth Branagh, who both played Poirot and directed the film. The people who are top of the hate list for those Zionist Jews in Hollywood are not Muslims, are not Arabs, not even Arab Christians. The people who are top of their hate list are not even the British soldiers who they bombed and shot in the 45 to 48 period. The people that hate even more than the British soldiers are the Palestine police. Really, and this has been inserted into that film as a sort of, nothing to do with the original book, nothing to do with the original film. It's been inserted into that film as a piece of score settling by the lords and masters of Hollywood with the Palestine police, because of course the Palestine police tried to do their duty under the mandate, tried to prevent the Zionist terrorists from bombing and murdering their way to control of that country.
Who was the director or producer of that film?
The director of it was officially Kenneth Branagh, a British Shakespearean actor, but of course the money people behind it were very interested to find. I haven't yet found out who the money people behind it were. I don't know who the producer was. I only know that Kenneth Branagh was the director. But it was a big money Hollywood movie. That I'm still in. I've only just seen this just the other day, so I'm still in the process of finding out who the producer was. It was very interesting to find out, because not only, and then of course the other bit of propaganda they inserted into that was that one of the many characters on this. You may know that the story is meant to be a fictionalisation of the Lindbergh case, the Lindbergh kidnapping. That's meant to be the story behind the story of what happens with this murder on the Orient Express. But anyway, Charles Lindbergh, of course, was the pioneer aviator and a great campaigner for long before Donald Trump, for the policy of America First. Alongside the Catholic priest Charles Coughlin, Charles Lindbergh was the most popular figurehead for keeping America out of European wars, keeping America out of overseas military entanglements, and so of course the usual suspects can't stand him either. So in a deliberate insult to the memory of Charles Lindbergh, and of course the memory of his kidnapped and murdered child, which is the true story which behind all of that, in a deliberate and calculated insult, they turned all of that on its head, and the fictionalised Lindbergh character in the new film is somebody married to a Jewess and deeply embedded with the question of Jewish refugees and deeply supporting Jewish refugees and all of this, and his best mate, ex of a British army officer, who's one of the characters in the film, who in the earlier film was played by Sean Connery, is now a Negro. So we're meant to believe that a senior pre-war British Army officer and British Army hero is a Negro, and that the Charles Lindbergh character is far from being what Jews would call an anti-Semite and a campaigner for America First, is actually a campaigner for Jewish refugees and for standing up to Hitler. The whole, absolutely everything, turned on its head in the most grotesque manner. So I'd actually, if you want to see propaganda at its most blatant, dare I say chutzpah at its most blatant, both on the racial question and on certain historical questions, this remake of Murder on the Orient Express is a classic example of it.
Peter, can I ask, was there a train in the film?
There is a train in the film.
Right, well that's something.
There is. They've kept that bit in, yes, and the visuals of it with the train and the avalanche and all of that are, of course, as you would expect with modern production standards and all of that, done very well.
Israel. An avalanche in Israel?
Well, no, because it's only in Jerusalem at the very opening scene.
Oh, I see.
And then that sort of sets the scene for the whole thing, and then they all set off from the Middle East to cross Europe. But so the question comes, and in relation to some of the things that Richard touched on earlier, why on earth are the establishment so worried about us that they engage in all this relentless propaganda? You and I might think that in the post-BNP world, and what's now the post-UKIP world, I dare to say, so it's pretty clear that that party is now not only hold below the waterline, it's sinking below the waterline, even as, visibly by the day. That why on earth should the establishment be so concerned about threats from the so-called far right and about the Jez Turner masterminded international neo-Nazi network and all of this? And it does remind me of what I've been reading about recently in the files on Colin Jordan, which again Richard referred to, that 6 or 7 volumes of these things were released a few weeks before Christmas, showing how MI5 had devoted quite considerable attention to monitoring Colin Jordan and other people, of the broader movement that he intersected with in the League of Empire Loyalists, John Bean's original British National Party, various other things. And this is just taking us up to 1968. No further than that, these volumes that have been released so far. Just to quote one thing that Jordan had said in an occasional newspaper he brought out at the end of the 50s called Black and White News, that was sold at the... It wasn't a BNP publication, but it was sold at British National Party events under John Bean's auspices.
Austin Brooks produced that.
Ah, right, that's interesting. Austin Brooks printed it. Thank you, Martin. Well, of course...
No, he wrote it.
He wrote it. That's very interesting. Because, of course, Austin Brooks was a leading figure in the League of Empire Loyalists, which Jordan himself was also in. And was, I think, the son of a prominent journalist, wasn't he, Martin? Colin Brooks.
Yes, Colin Brooks, Sir Colin Brooks, was the publisher and editor of a newspaper called Truth. And that got bought out by a bigger company, and they crushed that. And Chesterton wrote an article called "Why Was Truth Murdered?" And it was a result of that people supported Chesterton, and he brought out a magazine called Candor.
Yeah. Candor, indeed, which later brought out by Rosine de Boonville, I think. After. No. Was she not his right-hand woman for a while?
He used to go down to her house in Liz Forest to write it weekly.
I see.
But all she contributed was hysterical freaks.
Ah, there we are. So the record has been corrected there. Very good. But the point is that in this, under this headline "Blacks Invade Britain," at the end of the 1950s, Colin Jordan, Austin Brooks, all these pioneers, and of course the young Martin Webster, who almost before he was out of short trousers was in the forefront of these activities, was saying, "Here is a familiar sight in Britain today," said Black and White News, solemnly copied and put into the MI5 files where you can read it to this day. "Here is a familiar sight in Britain today. Another immigrant boat has docked, and from it another train packed with blacks has pulled into a British city. Already over 100,000 have come from the West Indies alone. Oh, for those days of innocence when one could speak in terms of 6-figure numbers rather than 7-figure numbers, ladies and gentlemen. But yes, already over 100,000 have come from the West Indies alone. Huge numbers of other coloured people have come from all over the world, including no less than 100,000 Indians and Pakistanis and other Asiatics. The total so far is in the region of 250,000. And this, I've just stressed for the sake of the film, that this is something I'm reading from a historical document, because if I were to say this in my words, or any of this in the room were to say this in our words today, we would no doubt be finding ourselves in the dock, because the law has changed significantly several times over since the days when this was written. Black and White News wrote, "This is only the beginning. More are coming every day. The government refuses to do anything about it, and in the coloured countries the birth rate is soaring. How many coloured people will there be in Britain in 10 years' time?" They are coming to stay, said Black and White News at the end of the 50s, and to make your country their country too. They are coming to live with you in your town, maybe in your street. Sooner or later you will be finding them next to you, in your restaurant, cinema, factory, office, club, hospital, swimming pool. Their children will be brought up hand in hand with yours at school. They will mix later on, quite likely they will marry later on. How will you feel about it? Now, it's not for me, especially given the state of the law in this country, it's not for me to say whether that prediction was fulfilled, and if it was fulfilled, what we as native Britons should make of it. But, and perhaps also not for me to say, because in fact the facts, ladies and gentlemen, I think, without me needing to speak about them, the facts on that matter speak for themselves, as the Romans would have said, res ipsa loquitur. I don't think we need to court prosecution by editorialising on that. So the reason why they're so concerned about us in 2017, 2018, the reason for all these establishment blogs, the reason why people are so worried despite our electoral insignificance for the time being. It's not that people are afraid of our election results. They're not afraid that people at the London Forum are going to be planning bomb attacks. They're afraid. Ultimately, they're afraid of two things. They're two interconnected things. They're afraid of the truth, and they're afraid of their own weakness. Not of our strength yet, but of their own weakness. Richard mentioned Italy earlier on, and this guy Beppe Grillo. Beppe Grillo's prospectus, Beppe Grillo's manifesto, wasn't exactly a high-level intellectual challenge to the establishment. It wasn't exactly neo-Nazism or anything else. His challenge to the establishment amounted to just one phrase, one Italian phrase, that he used time and time again in response to the politically correct Italian establishment. And he said, I'm not even going to translate the phrase because it's too obscene for a mixed audience. But the phrase in Italian was, for those of you that are familiar with that language, vaffanculo. Vaffanculo, he said, time and time again was his. That was what his manifesto amounted to.
It sounds very rude.
Was a giant vaffanculo to the entire Italian establishment, the media, the church, the academics, and the politicians, the business leaders, whatever and pretty much that's what our Brexit vote amounted to. It amounted to people up and down this country, in people who hadn't even bothered to vote in many cases before, and people who certainly, thankfully, wouldn't understand what vaffanculo means, but they were effectively saying that to the British establishment by putting their cross in the box for Brexit. It wasn't the majority of them were not people like Lord Pearson of Rannoch or whatever who have a particular long-standing obsession with constitutional issues. They weren't people who had ever voted UKIP before or even considered it, but they had the chance to say vaffanculo to the establishment, and they took it, and that's why we got Brexit. In Germany, in France, right across Europe, similar things have happened. Even where there isn't a coherent political alternative, a coherent nationalist party, a coherent anti-establishment party, one way or another support has leached away from the establishment. And our version of it was a little bit different last year. You might have thought that we were going in the opposite direction, because last year Labour and the Tories had a duopoly of the vote to a greater extent than for decades, squeezing out even the Lib Dems, squeezing out any alternative. However, things that were going on inside those two parties the fact that, that both of those parties are effectively ungovernable, the fact that the leader of the opposition is prepared, even at a time of alleged terrorist attack by a foreign power, to stand up and challenge the official line. All of those things indicate that, unlike the 1950s, when there was a duopoly and there was the so-called Butskellite consensus, and everybody sort of believed in the same thing, or supposedly believed in the same thing, nowadays nobody quite knows what they believe, and the country's never been more divided. That's one reason why divided and dispirited. And up and down the country, perhaps not in general elections, but if you study local by-elections, as I do for the regular update I do in H&D, in local by-elections, even with the death of UKIP, where people at local level are given the chance to poke the establishment in the eye by voting for some local protest vote party, some party that wants to break away their little town from the big council that they're part of, some party that's protesting against a planning application, anything that involves standing up and poking their supposed lords and masters in the eye, people are choosing that option time and time and time again. In other words, out there's an enormous appetite for some form of radical alternative, something that isn't business as usual. And that's why people are concerned about things like the London Forum and people coming into this country, for perfectly law-abiding people like Martin Sellner, Brittany Pettibone, Lawrence Southern, all those people, and not least because this spirit of resistance isn't just, no offence to Millwall fans, isn't just a spirit of no one likes us, we don't care, or a spirit of, let's all get a few pints down us and go and chant obscenities and punch people in the face. This spirit of resistance is spread among many, many respectable people. It's spread across universities. It's spread through this magic of the internet among young, respectable people who've just not prepared to take what their lords and masters say to them. And there might be people whose origins were on the left, people whose origins were on the Green Movement, not necessarily people whose origins are with us, but they're prepared to stand up and defy establishment opinion. Not least, last night, three of us heard a speech by the former Palestinian ambassador to Britain, Afif Safir, who said that although within Israel the situation has never been more hopeless in terms of getting any concession from Netanyahu, because he thinks he's unchallengeable, and the situation's never been more hopeless among people like Conservative MPs or Republican congressmen. At grassroots level, right across the old-fashioned left-right spectrum, more people than ever in Britain, in America, across Europe, across the world, are prepared to stand up and dare to express and support opinions that the establishment media would like to demonise as anti-Semitic. More and more people are prepared to embrace those ideas, to think the unthinkable, to challenge the unchallengeable. And the truth is that our post-industrial world faces many economic challenges, many societal challenges. The ageing population, increasing automation, and all of these things. The truth is that in Japan, for example, one reason why we're getting so much of this robotics, what's feeding through into the rest of the world, one reason is actually to do with the attitude of the Japanese people, which is very different to that of most European peoples, to immigration. That the ageing population in Japan are not prepared to fill that gap of caused by in the workforce caused by the ageing population. They're not prepared to fill that gap by importing immigrants. They've done that once or twice before, and they didn't like the consequences, and so they turned off the tap regardless of the economic issues involved and the financial issues involved. So they are prepared. That ageing population in Japan is, if necessary, prepared to make a financial sacrifice in getting their government, getting their companies and getting their government to spend an awful lot on researching robotics, so that a lot of those jobs that in Britain are being done by immigrants will be done in Japan by robots. And this ultimately will feed through to the rest of the world. But the origin of it is the Japanese people's concern that they want Japan to be recognisably Japan. And even when they're too old to look after themselves, and they're prepared to spend whatever it takes in the short term, and perhaps take an economic hit in their as they age, in order to preserve Japanese traditions. Because what's the point in having a comfortable old age if the country you leave behind you is no longer recognisable as Japan, no longer recognisable as Britain, no longer recognisable as Europe?
I think the food's ready.
The food is here, so I shall wind up in just 1 second. So what do? The answer is, in these circumstances, we hold our nerve. In a situation where the establishment is panicking, we must hold our nerve. And dare I say, since as it happens, the actor who played Corporal Jones in Dad's Army as a very young man, was a member of the BUF. So the message should be, as Corporal Jones said, don't panic. Don't make too much of minor differences within the movement. Minor differences between ourselves and Jada Franson locked up in prison, for example. We shouldn't make too much of those issues. We should focus on what matters and what unites us, i.e. the fundamental issue of identity, closely tied to the idea of national and racial sovereignty, which means a lot more than simply whether or not we're in the European Union. National and racial sovereignty means that we dare to stand up for British interests, dare to stand up for true European interests, dare to stand up for our racial interests. Racial identity is not a concept exclusive to white imperialists, still less to Nazis. Even in one of the world's few true multiracial societies, namely the Lebanon, multiracial countries, the Lebanon, in the 1980s, people who are now Hezbollah were involved in a local war called the War of the Camps against the incoming Palestinians, because they didn't want their area of southern Lebanon being taken over by people of a different culture. So there was that naturally, of course, exploited by the Israelis the other side of the border, but to an extent all over the world. There is this, not just in white countries, there's a natural feeling you do not want to be, as Mrs. Thatcher so dishonestly said, swamped. Yes. You do not wish to be swamped by people of another culture. So that's got to be our message to the people of Britain. That there is still, and there will be again, a movement in this country that stands up in a bigger sense than Brexit. Stands up in a bigger sense than Brexit for those people who do not want to be swamped. And who stands up for what Mosley once said in a book on these things about racial identity, that to support racial identity should be a natural extension of wanting to support your own family. That regardless of how our economy develops, regardless of the balance we strike between the free market and state intervention, all of these things, regardless of what sacrifices have to be made as the population ages, regardless of all those issues, whichever balance we strike, the sacrifices will only be acceptable and should only be acceptable to the British people if they know that Britain is being run for the British. That we accept an increase in taxation. We accept a degree of scrounging by benefit seekers. We accept a degree of tax dodging by multimillionaires. All of these things happen to a certain extent in any society.
Peter,
but we can only accept that. We can only accept that if we have Britain being run for the British and we have a policy of racial and national identity. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that.